There were a few drugs that bumped serotonin levels, and that's, I believe, where the idea that improving serotonin was going to fix depression came from, but that's long since been debunked. If it works, for example, once you start an antidepressant and you're increasing the serotonin levels to the synapses in the brain, then you would expect an immediate mood improvement, and we don't see that. It's well known that antidepressants typically take 4, 6, sometimes 8 weeks to really kick in, and that's if they're going to work. There are other mechanisms by which those antidepressants work for the people that they do work significantly for. But I can tell you that the majority of patients that come in to see me are on antidepressants, but they're coming to see me for ketamine therapy because even though they're scared to go off those medications aren't really doing what they need for them. So that whole serotonin idea has been perpetuated, but it's also been disproven.
Good. I had a friend in college, I was writing a research paper on psychedelics, shrooms for antidepressants, and she said she's been on antidepressants for years and has no faith of getting off it. She feels just hooked into it, and that's why we were working on it together. What makes ketamine different than the traditional SSRI in solving the problem?
It's a totally different mechanism, and so we can talk about how it works, or we can talk about its efficacy. I imagine we'll probably talk about both.
Yeah.
But in contrast to increasing serotonin or norepinephrine levels in the synapse or the space between nerves where the nerves talk to each other, ketamine acts on an entirely different receptor. It acts on an NMDA receptor. And it gets kind of convoluted, but actually, if you look at the brain, and you provide ketamine, you actually see an increase of glutamate. Glutamate is the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, and yet ketamine is what we call an antagonist, or it basically blocks the action of glutamate. So how does that make sense? It actually acts on inhibitory neurons. So when you block the action of the ketamine on an inhibitory neuron, now that inhibition is released, and so the nerves that it acts on then release more glutamate. And so that's the end mechanism. It really acts on AMPA receptors more, as far as the antidepressant effect. We also know that it stimulates a chemical in the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF for short.
Okay.
And what I tell my patients is just to think of brain fertilizer.
Okay.
What happens to your yard if you never fertilize the grass? It goes from green to yellow and eventually dead, right?
Yeah.
The same thing happens with depression. Depression isn't really so much a paucity of serotonin, it's multifactorial. But one of the things that we know is chronic stress or chronic cortisol exposure shuts down the production of this brain fertilizer. And so people are producing less of this growth factor, and so nerves in very important areas of the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, which is primarily responsible for planning or executive function, and the hippocampus, which is the memory function, and it's tied up in multiple other areas of the brain, those nerves atrophy, they wither. And so what ketamine does, quite impressively, is cause a massive release of this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and immediately those nerves start to regrow. We call that neuroplasticity, growth of nerves, rewiring of nerve circuits. It induces more synaptogenesis, so more of those talking points between the nerves. We also know that it calms inflammatory mediators or chemicals that are associated with inflammation that negatively impact how the brain works. So it's multimodal. It's neuroprotective. I mean, there's ketamine's even being looked at these days to address or possibly reverse, cognitive decline, like Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. So it seems like the overload of stress makes people too rigid, and the ketamine allows them to be a little more flexible, if we want to put it in acceptance and commitment therapy terms, would you say?
I don't know the research on that. What I can say comfortably is that the chronic cortisol production or exposure shuts down brain-derived neurotrophic factor, areas of the brain atrophy, and ketamine reverses that immediately. Now, it's not in one infusion. In one infusion, we see a nice a varied response, but it's short-lived. So typically within half a week or a week, whatever benefit you derived from that ketamine infusion is going to be gone. But if you jump back in there within 3 or 4 days and provide another infusion, then we're stacking benefit upon benefit upon benefit. And with that, we get more and more duration out of the treatment.
What's going on, guys? Thanks for checking out my channel. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and make sure to turn on notifications so you can see when I post again. See you next time.